This session, I think, is going to be really exciting. Some of these presenters have been at the Housing Is Summit before, so they may look familiar to you, and we're happy to have them build on their work about collective impact. We have also some new presenters with us, and we're really pleased to welcome them. So I will now turn it over to them to introduce themselves, but really excited to have them talking about the session today and sharing their expertise with us. Elise?
Great, thank you, Abra. So my name is Elisa Neto, and I'm a research analyst at the Urban Institute in DC, and I'll be moderating the session. So we just wanted to say welcome to everyone, and thank you for joining, and apologies again for the delay. This session is Housing Providers' Role and Collective Impact for Education and Beyond. So I'm going to start by giving you a quick overview of the session, introduce you to my fellow presenters, and then go over the agenda. So first, as you all know, housing is fundamental for generating better outcomes in education, racial equity, and many other aspects of people's lives. When we planned this session back in January, we were living in a different world. And the months and weeks since have given these issues a sharper lens through which we should view our work, the methods we use, and what it takes to make progress. So we attempt to bring some of that thinking into our original framing, including the impact of COVID-19 on communities, as well as a world that's fighting back against oppression and systemic racism. All that being said, we'd like this session to be as useful and meaningful for you as possible, and don't want to turn a blind eye to the pain and anger that many are feeling right now. While we have a set agenda, which I'll go through shortly, we want to make sure this is a space where participants feel comfortable voicing their top of mind thoughts and feelings, and we'll be flexible in terms of what folks would like to talk about and the directions our discussions go in. My fellow panelists will also touch on this when we break out into our separate rooms. Next slide, Micah. So I'm joined today by Colin Groff, the Executive Vice President of Strategy and Development of StriveTogether, and Griffith, the Director of Economic Mobility and Public Housing at Enterprise Community Partners, and Christina Hodgkinson, the Director of Resident Services at Akron Metropolitan Housing Authority. Next slide. And so today we're going to start with an overview from the presenters on collective impact, the role of housing providers and education partnerships, and the importance of centering racial equity and collective impact. We'll also hear what these ideas look like in practice on the ground. And then we'll move to breakout rooms for facilitated discussion. And finally, we'll come back together to share some reflections from those conversations. And so if no one has any questions, I'm going to move on to Colin. And remember, if you do have any questions at any point, please put those in the chat box and we'll monitor them as we go. So Colin.
Thank you, Elise. It is great to be with all of you in what's been, an incredibly heavy week, few months, year, 400 years. It is a tough time in this country and a really critical time, I think, to be reflecting on the way that we take action and the way that we organize ourselves to make change. And I think, the past few months and years and centuries have highlighted, if anything, the fact that, as we all know, structural and systemic oppression of marginalized communities in this country, including our Black colleagues and friends, it's bigger than any one individual. It's bigger than any institution. It's bigger than any sector. And so the solutions and the strategies that we take on, in many ways have to be at the scale to make the change that we hope to see. And, for myself, when I think about, the definition the story that I tell myself about racism, and many have probably seen this definition, it's the idea of prejudice plus power. And for me, when I think about collective impact, although it has a flawed and sordid history in some ways, I think about the potential of collective impact as a way to actually shift power and share power, and by doing so to deconstruct racism, leading to more equitable policies, tearing down the siloed systems that we've created, lifting up targeted strategies that actually get resources in the hands of communities marginalized by systems as they're currently constructed, and actually driving resources to the places where they can have the greatest impact and create more equitable outcomes. I feel like I have to say that there are historic and embedded flaws in collective impact. Even in so if anyone ever read the original SSIR, Stanford Social Innovation Review article about collective impact, it was written about us and about some of the work that we were doing in Cincinnati under the banner of the Strive Partnership. It wasn't even a name that we created. It was a name that was written about work that was happening in Cincinnati and in parts of Africa and across the world. But the idea of it was, how could you bring together all of the relevant sectors and partners pertinent to a particular social issue or outcome that you were trying to change? So if you were focused on homelessness, how could you bring together the various systems and structures that impact homelessness? If you were focused on education, how could you realize that educational inequities don't begin when a child gets to the classroom? They begin in the prenatal experience of the mother. They begin in the intergenerational poverty that has been created in this country. And so the ways of organizing, in our opinion, need to be cross-sector. They need to be cross-institution, and so we have crafted, and I'll drop in the chat box here for those that want to get into the weeds, what we call our theory of action. And so we have a bit of a love-hate relationship with the term collective impact. But what we've learned through the years is that there's a quality way to do this work, to do this collective impact work, and it's guided and crafted by actual communities on the ground. We get the chance to work with 68 communities in 29 states, representing 12 million children, including millions of children of color. And we really focus on how do we continue to design, affirm, refine our process through the work with communities. And so if you want to click on that link, there's a very detailed set of quality benchmarks and standards that we're learning. What I would just bring attention to is the flow of the work is about how do you actually get the solutions and the co-design of strategies in the hands of those that are closest to the work on the ground, to parents, to families, to students. How do you move from an institutional approach to one that puts children and families at the center of your collective efforts? The last thing I'll say is that when a few years ago we began to really hone in on the work to shift systems to create equitable outcomes, we asked our communities that in many ways were focused around education, what are the sectors that you need to work with to get to more equitable outcomes? And overwhelmingly, we heard from communities that housing was one of the key places to start. It was a foundational system. It was a system that impacted stability, impacted early childhood outcomes, impacted parents' ability to work, student mobility, so many factors across a child's lifespan. And so at that point, we were really excited to engage with enterprise community partners, the Urban Institute, and really to build our relationship with CLPHA. This is my third year now, being privileged enough to be a part of this event. And more than ever, I truly believe in our efforts to drive an equitable recovery. We have to build systems that cross housing, education, criminal justice, health, all of the systems that come together to compound the wicked and pervasive racial and ethnic disparities that we see and that have been so highlighted in the country at this time. So I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to share with you and to be a part of some of the small group discussions coming up.
Great. And so then I'm going to take from there. Thank you, Colin. And as I mentioned, I'm a researcher at the Urban Institute, and my work focuses mostly on housing and homelessness, housing discrimination, and the intersection of housing and education. So for this, I'm going to be talking about the role of housing providers and collective impacts for education outcomes. So as we all know, housing should never be a barrier to kids' learning, but there is a history of government-enforced exclusion and segregation in both housing markets and schools. And despite formally ending these processes, established patterns of segregation by race and income remain today. And where there's differential access to residential neighborhoods, differential access to public schools and school districts follow. So to ground my conversation, I'm going to be talking or focusing on a research project that we conducted in 2019 with enterprise community partners and StriveTogether, where we identified and learned from housing and education collaborations focused on addressing these systemic inequities. We looked at 10 partnerships across the country, targeting different sections of the cradle to career continuum. And partners included both housing authorities and nonprofit and private housing providers. So many of these partners were part of tapping into or part of collective impact initiatives. So we found that housing providers played a variety of roles across these partnerships. And I'm going to be focusing mostly on programming, metrics, and advocacy work. I want to note that housing providers in those partnerships were acting as the backbone agency for a number of them, and were responsible for bringing partners together, facilitating their shared vision and metrics, and creating MOUs and data sharing agreements. Some of these partnerships were developed out of existing relationships, but many were developed because one partner identified a need in their community and approached someone in a new sector. In terms of programming, many initiatives were focused on providing a supportive community or home environment for the kids. Housing providers would use shared spaces in their properties to offer supports to meet residents' non-housing needs on site. This can include case management, resident services, on-site educational programming, like early reading classes or after-school learning opportunities. For some housers, the strategy was mostly offering the space for partners to deliver services, but others were actively engaged in service provision along with those partners. Additionally, several of these partnerships used programs to close educational opportunity gaps for groups of students at high risk for housing instability or homelessness. These groups included housing insecure college students, families of K-12 students experiencing homelessness or who were housing insecure, and current or former foster care youth. Most strategies started with a housing subsidy, which was provided by the housing provider, and additional services were added onto that. Some initiatives secured additional funding, but many were using existing organizational resources or collaborating with partner organizations who had those necessary resources to do the work. Initiatives we spoke to also emphasized the necessity of coming together around shared goals and vision, and we're actively developing measurable outcomes for partnerships. Some programs focus on traditional education outcomes like kindergarten readiness or test scores among students. Others focused on really whole family goals, such as employment and public benefit programs or housing stability. And as many of you know, developing and executing a shared measurement strategy requires partners to trust one another and invest significant amounts of time and resources into that work. And again, as I'm sure many of you know, advocacy can be tricky for housers, especially for housing authorities. Private and nonprofit housing developers were really able to participate in traditional advocacy strategies with state and local leaders. Houses couldn't participate though, and those activities really relied on their partners to take the lead. Instead, they focused on using their program outcomes and their data to educate local leaders about the need for their programs, the need for collective work, and to explain why why their programs were helping kids in their communities. And so finally, many of these partnerships also emphasize the need and necessity of centering racial equity in both their partnerships and ongoing work. So I'm going to pass it off to Anne to talk about that important piece.
Great, thanks, Elise. Hi, I'm Anne Griffith, and I work at Enterprise Community Partners. And what I am talking about was really our economic mobility initiative and the intersection in our initiative with the housing sector and education. And what we have come to appreciate that there is no conversation about economic mobility that doesn't center on race, racial equity, and systems change. And for that reason, we have explored ways to define our approach through an anti-racist lens. And to date, we have landed on an inquiry-based inventory, which really just means that we ask ourselves a whole bunch of questions at each stage of our approach. Inherent in this work is the recognition that racial bias and organizational racial bias reflects the strength and prevalence of the dominant cultural norms that shape our institutions, our media, and the ways that we see each other. And as we know in the United States, our culture has been overwhelmingly shaped by the norms, preferences, and fears of white Europeans. And the term white dominant culture or even white supremacist culture refers to these normative characteristics and standards that characterize most organizations without being proactively named or chosen by the group, whether white-led, predominantly people of color, or people of color-led. Consequently, anti-racism then requires both an internal and an external set of actions. The internally focused actions entail reflecting on one's own implicit biases and stereotypes and then practicing ways to overcome them. And the externally focused actions seek ways to actively interrupt racism by challenging bias and discrimination in communities, institutions, and systems. Said another way, we realize that we need to actively use tools and processes to help us see the air that we breathe and the water that we swim in. Our inventory addresses 5 elements or principles at each stage of our approach. And I'll just share what our five principles are. We focus on disparate outcomes, entering engagements by assessing and acknowledging any disparate impacts, which means that we have to know our disaggregated data. Begin engagements to intentionally and explicitly undo racially based harm. The second is humility in relationships, continually adapting methods of partnership, evaluation, and reflection to be effective partners with communities rather than for communities. All relationships should be durable, patient, and humble. The third, courageous reflection for changing unconscious white supremacy, which charges us to create and maintain safe spaces for ongoing internal reflection of our impacts and create racially honest feedback loops from community partners. Acknowledge that everything that we do either combats or supports white supremacist culture. The fourth, power shifting. Identify power in our relationships and explicitly share our power. Whenever possible, actively reduce barriers to accessing resources and develop anti-racist programming. And then finally, number 5, advocacy and allyship, which requires us to use our power to challenge assumptions, build spaces that bridge power and culture silos, advocate for anti-racist policies, and to be an ally through sustained partner support, qualitative evaluation, and collegial support. But these 5 principles in our anti-racist approach are a work in progress on the best of days, but they are core to how and why we engage in this body of work at all. And at this point, I will transition to my colleague to talk a little bit about what it looks like in practice. Christina?
Great, thank you so much. Well, thank you so much to everybody for inviting us and letting us be a part of the conversation. Christina Hodgkinson, Director of Resident Services at the Akron Metropolitan Housing Authority. I'm going to give you a real quick overview, just to put a little bit of context about what our housing authority kind of looks like. And then I'll go through and really talk about how this work is done through the collective impact model on the ground. AMHA, our jurisdiction is Summit County, Ohio. The population of that county is over about 540,000, with the majority of our residents that are subsidized are living in actually the city of Akron, which is our large urban in our jurisdiction. We provide housing to over 25,000 individuals through various affordable housing programs, including 5,000 vouchers and 5,000 public housing units and another 900 or so mixed income units, with the largest percentage of our residents being children under the age of 18. Our population is largely made up of African Americans and or mixed race individuals. We know that our historically and even today, our system plays a role in the systemic racism, and we have the responsibility to contribute to empowering change in our community through our services. Our housing authority has a robust resident services department that supports early childhood programming to programming for seniors to live independently to building stronger communities. We are not a moving to work agency, but about 10 years ago, our leaders created a nonprofit organization in order to solicit philanthropic dollars to support our value-added services in our programs at the Housing Authority. Although we have a long history of providing services as a housing authority and having cross-sector partnerships, our partnerships are more important now than ever between combating COVID-19 and experiencing the unrest our country feels right now. We have seen our county wrap their arms around our residents through food giveaways, non-food giveaways such as diapers and other baby supplies, coloring books, chalk, and even virtual volunteering opportunities through card making for our isolated residents. And with our partners, we hope to continue to level the playing field to address disparities and social issues that we are experiencing. I'm going to focus now on our community's collaboration around early childhood education, our role as a housing authority, and how we began to play a bigger role in collective impact through our Reach Opportunity Center at Summit Lake. Countywide, we have a collective impact goal of cradle to career education to increase the number of students ready for kindergarten and increase the number of students reading at third grade reading level. Our Early Childhood Initiative program is also a small part of Summit County's Infant Vitality First Term, First Birthday movement to address the health disparities of African American infants and their moms. In addition to supporting positive relations with neighborhood and our community police officers through our family outreach events and other special events, because of COVID, unfortunately, we're not able to continue that conversation, but we are in conversations of alternative ideas where we can align education and police relations, including virtual storytelling, reading stories around racial inequities, and unifying hope and healing. Summit County Education Initiative is our county's collaborative backbone for our early childhood collective impact, being the backbone as well as playing the role of collecting, analyzing, and reporting out community progress outcomes through the data. Collaboration of many different sectors of the community are brought together through their leadership, including government, human service organizations, school districts, health institutions, nonprofits, preschools, housings, etc. You get the idea. This collective impact model has evolved to where our local philanthropy has aligned their funding priorities around educational successes, primarily focusing on our largest urban school district in our county, which is Akron Public Schools. Our role as a housing authority within this larger collective impact is twofold. One is we are a direct provider, and the second one is we do provide space on site for local preschools and other programs that support our community-wide goal. As a provider, we provide home visitation services through a continuum of 2 programs, Parents as Teachers and the Spark Ohio program. Both emphasize mom, dad, and other primary caregiver to be the child's first and most important teacher. Parents as Teachers supports the social and emotional development until age 3, and then they have the option to continue services through our Spark Ohio program from 3 to 5 that transitions the focus into reading and math skills, preparing our kids and their families for school and our schools for our families. As the children get ready for preschool and/or kindergarten, all providers in our community complete a transitional skills summary assessment and is shared with the next provider. Baseline and comparison data is analyzed to determine kindergarten readiness. The KRA and third grade reading tests are indicators to determine if collectively our community efforts support more of our kids being ready for kindergarten and are reading at state grade level. Because of all this work, about 4 years ago, the Housing Authority had the opportunity to apply for a federal HUD grant, a $4 million grant to build an educational workforce development facility, now called the Reach Opportunity Center at Summit Lake. This was a huge collaboration between Akron Public Schools and their leader, which I hope is in this session, Dr. David James. This center collaborative began using the collective impact model that focused on the cradle to career educational opportunities for residents living in Summit Lake. And during that time, I want to let you know that during that time, the reason why that neighborhood was selected is it was the most impoverished neighborhood in Akron, and it had at that time lost its neighborhood school. The collaborative wanted to bring access to education for the neighborhood by providing more early childhood seats so that the children will be prepared to transition their neighborhood elementary school building, which is 3 miles away. The 3 major areas of the center include early childhood programming and services, after-school programs, adult education programs, and job readiness training. All have the overarching goal of integrating a multi-generational model, adults doing education while children are doing education, collectively and together, building a community and support around the importance of education. And we just don't stop at education. The collaborative also recognized that we couldn't just provide education without providing those wraparound services. AMHA and Akron Public Schools serve as the dual leaders in the collaboration, with AMHA being the backbone. Goals of the collaboration were agreed upon and aligned with larger educational goals that Summit Education Initiative was already measuring regarding kindergarten readiness, reading at grade level, prepared for high school math in 9th grade, they were achieving at grade level, and participating in enrolled, enlisted, and also employed opportunities. Collaborative partners contributed to the overall goal of the center. Initially, we focused on traditional educational opportunities and quickly found out that we needed to pivot and provide some non-traditional educational opportunities as well. I have about 4 challenges that we face as a housing authority in this particular model. And one is just simply being the backbone. The housing authority doesn't have the infrastructure of really pulling that together as far as capacity wise. And so it had been a difficult time balancing between being the landlord of the property as well as holding our partners accountable to contribute to the larger whole. We've also struggled with shared measurement system. Although we agree upon what needs to be measured, what goals we want to achieve, collecting that data and making sure that it is aligned has always been a challenge, and we continue to work on that even through an evaluation plan. And then finally, the last 2 is sustainability. One is because, the housing authority received the dollars to build and build the property and to build the center. We're still, it's still finding a challenge of fundraising for the building to continue to operate. Currently everybody has free space except for our partners, Akron Public Schools and AMHA, as well as our partners in Head Start, who share the cost of common use space, and we take care of our own parts of the building. However, collectively, the nonprofits using our space get it for free. And so, collectively, we still continue to navigate how we can sustain that property and the operations of that property. And then finally, housing authorities are housers. We have a difficult time sometimes understanding managing commercial or community buildings. We are getting better at it and improving every day, but still remains a challenge that it needs to operate differently than our traditional residential buildings and developments. In 2019, we hit 5 years since the building opened, and we look way different today than we did 5 years ago. We are evolving, and right before COVID, we were in the process of hitting that reset button around the collaborative and collective impact model, including residents from the neighborhood on the steering committee, which wasn't done previously. In the larger collaborative, really wanted direct feedback from the residents and the larger community using our services. I'm excited for the next phase of the collective impact model for REACH and the neighborhood collaboration. We are more than just a building. We are excited to learn from our original mistakes and springboard into making an even bigger impact in that neighborhood. So with that, Elise, I'll shoot it back over to you if you want to take us to the breakouts. Whew.
Great. Thank you, Christina. And so, so we will be moving into breakouts shortly. We were originally planning on coming back to do a more share back with the group, but we want to spend as much time in the breakouts as we can. So actually we're going to end there. And then what we're going to do is come together as presenters and then share some of those high takeaways that we each hear in those breakouts on the conference website after the session. And so with that, I think we can distribute and start.
Thank you. Nicole's going to sort everyone. So since we're not coming back, I just wanted to do a quick plug to, if you're on the app, please fill out evaluation of the session when it's over, but also keep an eye out for an email that you'll get at the end of today with a SurveyMonkey link. We really appreciate any feedback. Thank you.